Oregon State's future conference alignment is not certain, and it reminds me of a piece of Star Wars music. It's known as Duel of the Fates.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with our media rights and mostly team-free and I think still beloved Conference of Champions, but like kind of, sort of, not really. Like, comment, subscribe, rate, review, please and thank you wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. When you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon today. So today we're talking about Oregon State, which means we've got Carter Bahns, BeaverBlitz.com, 24/7 Sports National Writing Desk. We so appreciate that he makes time for us little people down here on Earth. He is now up in a galaxy far, far away. Speaking of which, I titled the thumbnail on this episode, for those watching on YouTube, you're aware of this, Duel of the Fates, and I alluded to that in the open, which is a wonderful and beautifully composed piece of music by my man John Williams in the Star Wars prequel films in Revenge of the Sith. It's excellent. All the Star Wars fans out there know what I'm talking about. The reason I bring that up on today's show is because that piece of music is underscoring the battle between the Jedi and the Sith, good and evil, light and dark. And it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that's where Oregon State is at right now. They're going to go to this league or this league, this league or this league, this league. And we really don't know. And we're kind of waiting for the culmination of that. And it kind of seems, Carter, like Stanford is one of the key players in this realignment puzzle that are trying to put it all together that will affect what Oregon State can ultimately do. Because if Stanford and Cal aren't able, and it seems like Stanford's been a bit more vocal with regards to, messaging and calling the Big Ten or the ACC in all this sort of stuff, if they don't get into a Power 5, then they're left to try and rebuild the pack with Oregon State and Washington State. But if they do, then that kind of seals the fate, so to speak, for Oregon State and Wazoo by extension, right?
Yeah, you're not building a new power conference around Oregon State and Washington State. You're not building a power conference around two schools. I don't care who they are. You just need so much help at that point. And frankly, the Oregon State and Washington State brands aren't strong enough to uphold and bolster, what you try to build around. So, yeah, it's key to have four intact. Obviously, Stanford and Cal have had down years recently on the football field, and you can question their commitment to athletics, particularly at Cal. But they're still decently sized brands, a good TV market, and schools that have been part of this Pac-12 footprint for years, and keeping them in the mix gives you four teams that you can build around. At that point, you only really need 4 or 6 as opposed to the 8 or 10 that you would need if you just had the two schools. And obviously, you have a little bit more tradition there too, as well. I mean, these are schools that Oregon State and Washington State have played against for decades and decades. And, as we lose a bunch of tradition and historic rivalries in college football and you name it, I think, keeping some semblance of that together in a new conference could help the league catch on a little bit.
Yeah, and we're all just kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop in all of this. And I think the risk, if the ACC and Big Ten do firmly and finally say, no, we're not bringing in Stanford and Cal, it just would feel, Carter, like the answer is, well, they're not doing it right now. Like they're not adding them at this time because they once upon a time vetted and cleared Oregon and Washington to join. Remember, that report was many, many months ago. They didn't add them until later when they were able to get the best potential opportunity. And that's why it's unfortunate for Oregon State and for Washington State as well, because they're in a situation where, look, no matter what they do, they don't control their own future. Because even if Stanford and Cal get turned away by a Power 5 conference right now, that doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. And as soon as that option arrives, they're gone. And so they have to simultaneously hope they want to join the Pac. But then there's, I think, some risk to that, because if in 3 years Stanford and Cal leave to go to the Big Ten or the ACC, and after saying they were going to, stay and rebuild the Pac here, you're kind of in the same spot you were before.
That's the tough part, I think, for Oregon State and Oregon State fans throughout this whole process that's taken, over a year now since USC and UCLA left. It's always been that the worst case scenario has always been on the table in the back of everyone's mind, and knowing that there's really nothing you can do to prevent that. Oregon State we've had this conversation for again, over a year now. Oregon State and Washington State are not driving the bus. They're not the factors in this conference.
They're not even on the bus right now. They're trying to get on a bus and figure out which bus. They're the kid walking out of the school to go on the field trip, and there's 7 buses out there, and they're like, well, which bus are we supposed to get on? And the person organizing the field trip is looking at them and going,
the problem is
figure it out.
The person who's organizing the field trip doesn't even want them to go. That's the thing. And that's the unfortunate part. It just feels like you have no control over the situation, and what other schools do is going to dictate where you end up. And it's unfortunate, because I think these are 2 schools that add so much value to the sport. You can think about the last 20 years, how many foundational moments in college football involved these 2 schools. I mean, Oregon State's upsets, the Giant Killers, their rise under Jonathan Smith playing a huge role in the final year of the Pac-12, Washington State under Mike Leach, being a team that everybody in the country wanted to see. I mean,
everybody
people would stay
loved
out
them
for Pac-12 after dark on the East Coast to watch Mike Leach's Washington State team. So to lose those schools because they're not as big of a brand as Washington or Oregon, I think it's obviously kind of tragic when you think about what you're losing as far as tradition goes and as far as parity in the sport. It's again, I just keep going back to the fact that this whole thing is sad in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think I've had you on since the Pac ultimately, as we know it, at least folded. And look, I've talked about the Mountain West and the American this week on the show because they are, realistic options for Oregon State and Washington State. I'm more of a Mountain West over American Conference guy, but I could see the appeal to going to the American. There is some pedigree and prestige there. I think that's not quite as appealing when you remove Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF, because you say, well, Memphis has been to a New Year's Six. Okay, that's true. Tulane just won a New Year's Six bowl, but was that where Tulane's program was really at, or was that kind of a fluky season in a good way? We don't really know, because the season prior, Tulane won 2 games, then they won 12 games. If they go back and win 6 games this year, suddenly Tulane might not be such an appealing option, especially given the fact that the American has gone down. Now, I expect Tulane to be a good team this season. I think they have the pieces there, but just on the Green Wave specifically, that's still kind of a wait and see. So when you compare those as your top 2 brands from a football standpoint and whatever potential SMU may have with their highly ranked transfer portal class this year, and you compare that to what I've seen Boise State be at their peak, that's higher than anything that exists in the American Conference right now, unquestionably. Boise State once upon a time played a preseason or a non-conference game against Georgia and beat them. That's a thing that happened in college football. I know. I saw it. I remember it. It was pretty awesome. But Boise State at their peak is higher than any of them. Fresno State, San Diego State have had really, really good seasons. So I think there's a lot of interplay there. You might be a little deeper in the American now. I think when you get to the bottom of the Mountain West, it's not as strong as the bottom of the American. But overall, I lean Mountain West over the American right now. But there's several questions about Oregon State's future. One of them is not the question I have for all of you, which is why haven't you checked out FanDuel yet? Did you know football season is about to kick off? It's literally less than 10 days away. We're going to have college football games being played and less than 10 days away. And you can bet on college football or you can bet on anything else all season long as the gridiron gets back into the swing of things. Right now, you can bet on a Super Bowl winner, and you can get bonus bets every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets for every victory. You can use your bonus bets on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Start earning bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook, and they've got all the Pac-12 lines, over-unders, and whatnot. And we're going to be talking about Oregon State's later in the show as well. You can find it all on FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get your betting fix for this season and beyond. Every day on this show, I need a second segment sip, but it is becoming more and more clear to me that I need football to actually be here more than I even need those. It's true. That's where we're at, because football is king, and we cannot wait for it. And we'll get to that in a sec. But a few questions to answer that came in via the mailbag, which is always available to you, whoever you are, wherever you are, however you're listening to or watching the show. YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter at Smalls_55 or at LO_Pac-12. DMs and mentions wide open. Eric sent in 4. They were a little bit longer. But he said, "Hi Spencer, big fan of the Locked On Podcast. I listen to it almost every day on my walk to class." Love that. "As an Oregon State fan, the past few weeks and days have felt like a gut punch after watching all the other schools leave us and Washington State left out. And with the uncertainty surrounding everything, I had some questions I'd love to hear your opinion on." Now, they wrote some long questions, so we'll just kind of summarize here. The first one is surrounding independence and whether that will come into play. I think you and I agree, Carter, that I could see temporarily the Bay Area schools maybe being able to go independent. You don't have to be Notre Dame to do it. I mean, there are other independent football programs in the country that are able to put together a schedule and work out the finances somehow and get money from those games. It's complicated, but not impossible. I could see the Bay Area schools doing that, but I don't see a world in which Oregon State and Washington State are not a member of some conference, even if it's the Mountain West or the American.
Yeah, look at the independent schools that have remained independent for a long time without joining a conference. It's Notre Dame, it's Navy, it's these private schools that have alternate streams of revenue. They have big brands, you name it. Anytime you see a school get left behind in conference realignment, this happens every few years. A school goes independent. More often than not, they either drop down to FCS or they join a smaller league. You can think back as far as the Pacific Northwest goes. This happened with Idaho when the WAC crumbled. They went independent. That didn't really work out. They joined the Sun Belt, which I think is Oregon State's American option, and then they go FCS. So, it's not a model that has proven to work for other schools in the past. Now, Oregon State has more tradition and more resources than in Idaho. But I think the point stands. It's not a long-term option for Oregon State. You need stability. And that's why I think the Mountain West is the go-to option there. If you can't get admitted into one of the other power leagues. I do think, maybe if the Pac-12 is not viable, you go independent for 1 year until you find a path forward. Like, maybe that works, but TV networks aren't going to be rushing out to carry Oregon State games. I mean, where's your revenue coming from? So it just doesn't make sense in my mind to go that route at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Bay Area's got a little bit more market power to be able to make that sort of move. But even for them, I don't know that I see them. Like, Stanford's got a big brand, sure, but Cal, could they do? I don't know. I think that's an iffy proposition at best. Now, the next question that Eric asked was in regards to what happens to the program at Oregon State if they ultimately end up in a G5 conference. And by the way, I think the Pac, no matter what, I don't see, unless a Big 12 offer materializes, which I don't anticipate, which we'll get to in just a sec, unless the Beavs were to have that happen, I don't think even the Pac can be considered a power conference, whatever they rebuild it as. Even if it's Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, Washington State, and then you add, I don't know, 4 teams from the American and then 4 from the Mountain West the following year, that's a G5 league to me. A really good one. Could be a really fun one, but I don't see how that gets recognition as, one of the autonomous 5 leagues or Power 5 conferences, whatever you'd want to see that as. So at that point, do you think there would be a drop in the quality of player that the Bees and the Cougs can attract? And would you have any concern, Eric is wondering, about coaches deciding to go on to different opportunities where they could maybe make more money?
Long term, maybe. Short term, not so much. And I think this is because Oregon State is a program that has never been about the glitz and the glamour, or you're going to come here because you're going to compete for a championship right away. No, this is a program where if you're a recruit, you commit because of the coaching staff and their proven ability to develop you over 3 or 4 years, and the chance to have a really good season every 2, 3, 4 years. Oregon State, from a coach's perspective, I think is in a good spot because it has a head coach who is an alum, who knows how to sell the program, who has a young family, and who I think wants to be there long term. Maybe down the road he looks at other options, but you and I have talked before about Jonathan Smith's job stability and his likelihood to stay in Corvallis. And I think both of those things add up to him being there for a long time, regardless of what conference the Beavers are in. So, long term, yeah, sure, your resources are probably going to pale in comparison to those Big 10, Big 12, SEC schools. And maybe that hurts you recruiting a bit. Maybe that hurts. I think it hurts a little bit more on the assistant side of the coaching staff. But all in all, I don't see it being crippling right away. Long term, though, I think you will see that gap kind of grow between Oregon State and the power schools. But that doesn't mean Oregon State can't be, the flagship program in a Mountain West or an American. I think that's absolutely on the table in the long term.
Yeah, and on the players' side of things, I agree with the way that you put all of that. But on the players' side of things, nobody goes to Washington State or Oregon State, even if they are good football players, thinking that those are glamour programs that are going to, play in these huge games and have big-time non-conference opponents. Like, I don't think Cam Ward transferred to Washington State just because they had a game against Wisconsin in 2022 and 2023. I think he would have transferred there anyway because he wanted an opportunity to play. And I think that those are the sorts of transfers that Wazoo and Oregon State can attract. A DJU, for instance, who's a rehabilitation project compared to what he was as a quarterback when he was at Clemson. And those sorts of guys go to G5 schools all the time. Like, you see guys really popping. It's like, yeah, he was recruited originally to this school, and then he ended up going down here and, really dominating or being really good, or he got overlooked by Power 5 schools or whatnot. So I don't think there'd be a mass exodus of players like that, because the opportunity, especially in a world with a 12-team playoff, if they're in a conference that is a G5, which is, I think, the only realistic scenario at this point, even if it's a Pac rebuild, they are still going to have a chance to go to the playoff, kind of the same one, probably the same likelihood, maybe even a better likelihood than they had before, because if you win a conference championship, well, you might be one of the highest rated conference champs. And if you go 12-1, that might be something feasible. But before we get to the schedule breakdown, I want to just wrap up these 2 questions from Eric and make sure, because I so appreciate you all sending in questions and whatnot, want to make sure we get to them all. The last 2 kind of build off each other about whether or not a Big 12 offer materializes now or whether it could in the future. I think now the Big 12 is done. I don't think there's any realistic world in which the Big 12 decides all of a sudden, yeah, we'll take Oregon State, Washington State. Like, they got, as Brett Yormark described, their dream scenario. And they said they're not adding UConn and they're not adding Gonzaga because, yeah, we got the dream perfect scenario we wanted. We got all 4 of those schools. Of course, that was aided by the Big 10, but still, the Big 12 got what they were looking for. So I think they're done now. But in the future, Carter, 2030, when the current media deal that the Big 12's got is up, I don't know how Oregon State and Washington State, along with Boise and Fresno, wouldn't be, and San Diego State, the next group of targets for the Big 12.
Absolutely. And I think this ties back to the point that you made about the college football playoff, which is something that I think is being left out of the conversation here. This is the silver lining for Oregon State. Your access to the college football playoff, I think arguably is easier in the Mountain West than it would be in a 12 or 10 team Pac-12. Oregon State, we talk about Oregon State immediately jumping into the Mountain West and being a contender. If you're the best team in the Mountain West next year, you might be in the college football playoff in this 12-team format. And now we will see with the playoff moving forward how things are structured as far as automatic bids and whatnot, because this 12-team format as it stands only works for 2 years, and then they will renegotiate. And potentially restructure. But for these 2 years, if you're a group of 5 school and you're a good group of 5 school, I think you have a pretty solid chance to get into the playoff. Again, we'll see if the committee stacks the deck against them. Are they gonna rank mediocre Power 5 schools higher than an undefeated or one-loss group of 5 school? Yeah, I don't think that's out of the question. But with the way that history has gone, a 11-1 Oregon State team, a 12-0 Oregon State team that wins the Mountain West is going to have a pretty solid chance of getting in there. So all of that being said, you do that for 5 years, you're the team in the Mountain West. You're one of the 2 teams in the Mountain West. You make a college football playoff appearance. You win a bunch of games. Absolutely, you're going to be a candidate for further expansion. When the Big 12 is looking to bolster its brand because the SEC has added half of the ACC and, a couple of big brands go to the Big 10 and make that a 24-team conference, don't you think the Big 12 is going to want to keep up and add the best schools available, which are probably going to be your Oregon States, your Washington States, maybe your Cals and Stanfords too? Like, I think that's 100% on the table.
I agree. All right, let's get to the fun part. The part we've all been waiting for such a long time, ever since, frankly, DJ Uiagalelei transferred to Oregon State. We've all wanted to know, are Carter and I going to accurately predict Oregon State's record this year? Are either of us going to go 12 for 12 picking their games? We're about to find out. Now, last year, Carter, we came on here to predict this record, and we kind of collectively hit a home run. I had 8-4. They ended up 9-3, of course, thanks to that rather unfortunate fourth quarter last week of the regular season, might I say. But anyway, I think you had them at 8. Did you have them 8-4 last year?
I might have been really low and said 7-5, but I think I went on the record with 8-4 a few times too.
I think we were both 7 or 8. They ended up being 9, but we both loved them automatically over 5.5, and that was an easy over bet. Now, this year, it's a little bit trickier because the Beavs are not going to catch anybody by surprise. Their win total is 8.5, second highest total in the pack. Now, I think they're a better football team than UCLA. I like them more. I like Oregon State's schedule a lot. I have a couple questions on defense, and I think it's fair to ask a question but not be like overly concerned about DJ Uiagalelei. But this schedule that we're about to run through game by game and make our picks, I feel really good about for Oregon State, and I think their win range is probably 8 or 9. You'll know what I feel by the time the show comes to an end, but I think 10 wins is a heck of a lot more likely than 7.
Yeah, that's what I said before the show, before we hit record, and that's
false. I'd never heard it before. I didn't take that from anybody. I don't steal people's lines. That doesn't happen.
Hey, I'm not saying you stole it. I'm just saying I agree with you. No, I've been saying all offseason 8.5 is the perfect number if you're Vegas, because every time I run the schedule and play hypotheticals, I end up in the 8, 9, or 10 range. Mm-hmm. I too think 10 wins is more likely than 7, but I don't think 7's off the table. There's a chance that the defense is nowhere near as good as it was last year because of all of the departures. There is a chance that DJ doesn't flourish in a system that better utilizes his talent. It would take all of that to happen, and for a couple of bad breaks to occur for Oregon State to win 7 games. I think the floor is more realistically 8. But I do think Oregon State has the potential here with this favorable schedule, getting almost all of its quote unquote toughest games at home, save for Oregon. Oregon's the only ranked team that's going to play on the road unless Washington State and Arizona win more than
I wouldn't sleep on Washington State I think Washington State's the only team that could be ranked. They'd have to beat Wisconsin, but they beat them on the road last year, so don't tell me it can't happen.
Yeah. I just think it's a favorable enough schedule that if Oregon State wins 10 games again this year, nobody's going to bat an eye at it. If Oregon State wins 11 games and wins the Pac-12, yeah, some people are going to be surprised, but we can realistically talk about that being a possibility this year, and people aren't going to call us crazy.
Right.
So I like the over, but I do think 8 wins is
it wouldn't be shocking
possible scenario there.
I would be pretty surprised given the way the schedule sets up if they went 7-5. I think that'd be a massive disappointment, frankly, for Oregon State after the excitement of last year. But 8-4, I don't think it'd be a disappointment. I think it'd be like left something on the table. Probably lost a game that you should have won, lost to somebody who you just look at and go, how do we lose to them, or how do we give that game away, or something like that. So let's just kind of bounce back and forth here, popcorn style, and go game by game. So they're at San Jose State week 1. They're almost a 17-point favorite on the road. I don't see a big upset here.
Me neither.
Okay, good.
It's week 1. Anything can happen, I suppose. And San Jose State has been good.
San Jose State doesn't have a game to get ready either, and Oregon State's got a heck of a lot more talent there. So I'll take the Beavs. Hot take. UC Davis week 2 at Reeser. Again, no, I'm not even going to ask you. I know what you're going to say. So we'll go to San Diego State week 3. Definitely the toughest of the non-conference games, but this is at Reeser. If it were at San Diego State at Snapdragon, I'd be a little more concerned, but I frankly am not that worried about this one after their thrashing of Boise State last year at Reeser Stadium.
I'll put it as simply as this. I don't see Oregon State losing to a Mountain West team at home.
Yeah, I think that's simple and to the point. Okay, now it gets interesting. The tone-setting game against Washington State. Mm-hmm. I'm going with the Beavs, but I won't. This is such a huge game for both teams to get a feel for where they're actually at as they begin conference play. If Oregon State goes and wins this game, it's a big one for them, and I think they will.
So I'm almost 50-50 here. And we talked about, before we hit record, about ESPN, FPI, loving the Beavs in this spot.
Yeah, by a lot, like 71% on the road.
Yeah, and I just don't see it being a blowout win by any stretch. I think Washington State is, at worst, the 8th best team in the conference, but more
easily at worst,
the 6th or 7th. And Oregon State could very well be the 4th or 5th best team in the conference. So I think it's a lot more evenly matched than some people want to give it credit for. I will give Oregon State this win, but I think that will foreshadow a game against Arizona later in the year that at least one of us might pick the other way, because it is very possible that you slip up in one of these two spots. These are Oregon State toughest road games outside of Oregon.
Oregon State, by the way, last 2 years they've had winning records. They have been dominant at home. They have not done great on the road. Yep. They very nearly lost to Stanford on the road last year. They had the blowout loss to Utah on the road last year. Like, they have had their fair share of road struggles, which brings us to the next week, Utah at home. The way that I think you and I both looked at this is they have Utah here, and then second to last week of the regular season, they have Washington, both games at home. That's one of those scheduling breaks we talked about. I don't think Oregon State wins both, but I don't think they lose both either. I'm taking them to lose to Utah and beat Washington later in the year.
Okay, I'm the opposite here. I like Oregon State over Utah, and I think Washington is tougher. And I'll tell you why. It's Oregon State beat Utah at Reeser a couple of years ago in a really gritty game. These are two very similar teams that play almost identical brands of football. The key here is Cam Rising. How healthy is he?
That's fair.
We don't know. I mean, if this game was in November, I might lean Utah. But the fact that this is a September game, I mean, we're almost a month away from this game being played. This is like 5 or 6 weeks out.
I know.
And Cam Rising's status is still up in the air, returning from a torn ACL. He'll be what, like 9 months removed from a torn ACL for that game.
He's
not under center
to be,
for Utah.
I mean,
Oregon
he's
State's favorite.
expected to be ready for the season. But my biggest question for Utah going into the season, I've got a big question for every team, and for Utah, is Cam Rising playing every Pac-12 game? Because he didn't last year. He missed the Washington State game. They were able to eke it out. If he misses that game, I would definitely switch my pick and take the Beavs.
And even if he's ready for the season, is he 100%? Or is he coming in at 80? And
Yeah.
if you're coming in at 80, can you stay at 80? Can you get to
or do you
100?
get dinged up as the year goes
Exactly.
on? Yeah, I think that's okay. I think that's fair. So then they go at Cal, and then they host UCLA. I've got them winning both of those games. Like the Bears, though, I like the Beavs a little bit more.
I agree with both here. Oregon State lost at Cal 2 years ago in a really disappointing game.
Don't see it happening again.
Yeah, a game that Oregon State should have won, but that was pre Trent Bray. The defense was putrid in that game.
They lost to Colorado that year.
Yeah.
Yeah, they lost to 4-8 Colorado. Yeah, I'm with you there. Now, here's where you mentioned it earlier. I'm going to take Arizona to beat the Beavs only because the game is in Tucson. And I think Arizona is a good football team as well. I think they've made additions on defense. I love their offensive personnel. They bring in Montana Lamonius Craig to supplement the loss of Dorian Singer. They've got T-Mac and Jacob Cowing. They've got Jaden DeLora. Their run game is solid. As long as their offensive line can be average, I think Arizona is 7-5. I talked about it, last week on the show when I made their record prediction. I think Arizona's 7-5 this year. So on paper, it looks like a bad loss for the Beavs, but I don't think it's the worst loss they could take this year.
What does every Pac-12 team have in common?
We all lose to each other.
Bingo. And no Pac-12 team has ever on the table in conference play. And pretty much every team every year has a loss that they look back on and say, like, that's a team we should have beat.
Right. Or a game we should have won.
Right. And I think this game has that potential, with the caveat that if Oregon State wins this game, color me non-surprised if they lose to Washington State. Like, I think if Oregon State has a disappointing loss on the schedule, it is one of Washington State and Arizona. I'll give the loss to the Arizona game, but they're coin flippy to me as far as, if you're going to drop one goes. So
yeah.
For the sake of putting a loss on the schedule, I'll assign it to the Arizona game, but it could be the Washington State one.
Right. I could see that as well. I could see them losing to Washington State and beating Arizona. Could totally see it. Next two games at Colorado, hosting Stanford. Colorado, the tougher of those two games. You're going to have a difficult environment there in Folsom, but I'm confident in Oregon State to win both of those games. And then I've got them beating Washington and losing to Oregon on the road to end the season. So I end up with the Beavs at 9-3. Where do you fall as they come down the home stretch?
So they win at Colorado, even if the Buffaloes hit their ceiling.
I agree.
I think the Buffs at best are a 5 or 6 win team, but that is far more unlikely than 2, 3, or 4 wins in my mind.
I'd say 3 or 4.
That's a win on the road, I think, comfortably. You get Stanford here in a tune-up before an absolute gauntlet to close the season.
It's another reason I like them against Washington, by the way, because Stanford is they're not going to be, I don't think, like overly worn out. They won't be emotionally drained. I think they're going to be supremely confident and feeling good going into the matchup with the Huskies, a game that they should have won on the road a season ago. And Washington's favored in that game. The line's already out for it. It's one of the few that you can see it. You can check it all out on FanDuel, of course. But I would lean. I go Oregon State there, and then I take them to lose to the Ducks. Everybody knows I'm an Oregon fan, but winning at Autzen Stadium historically is very difficult. And I think Oregon State's a good football team. I also happen to think Oregon will be a good football team this year. So I think that's how they have a little 3-game win streak and then lose to the Ducks in the game formerly known as the Civil War.
Oregon State fans are going to hate me for this. I think they finished the season 0-2.
That would be tough.
I picked them to beat Utah,
right?
And I do that saying that, okay, you're going to split Utah and Washington, and I think Washington's the tougher matchup for them just because the questions on defense are in the second level. The front seven's going to be good. The defensive line is probably going to be the best Oregon State has had in at least a decade. The linebackers are going to be solid, but you lose a lot in the secondary, and that could be costly against Washington, a team that is going to pass the ball at a high rate and at a high success rate because they did it last year. I think that is a 50-50 game on this schedule if there ever was one. I would not be shocked if Oregon State wins it. But if I'm picking a loss, again, between those two games and Utah and Washington, I'm assigning it to Washington. And then, man, this game against Oregon has the potential to be one.
Oh, the stage is going to be huge. Like the feeling, the vibe, it is going to be nothing civil about it, as they say.
If both teams are playing at their highest level all season, this is probably a Pac-12 title semifinal game.
Yep, I can see it.
And obviously it's the rivalry element. The key here is it's on the road. It's at Autzen. And historically, Oregon State goes into Autzen, bad things happen. Oregon comes into Reser, and recently bad things happen. I tend to roll with the home team in this series when it's evenly matched, and so I have to go Oregon there. And so, unfortunately in this scenario, Oregon State finishes 9-3 with 2 losses at the end of the season, and you lose all of that momentum you had built. But again, if they beat Washington, it's a 10-win team. So here I am again with, I think 9 wins is more likely than 8, but I do think 10 can kind of fall in their lap if they get a break, or
I think
if they beat more good teams than some people might expect.
I think it's an 8 to 10 win team.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm at 9, because I'm right in the middle of it. So we're both at 9-3. Carter Bahns, BeaverBlitz.com, 24/7 Sports National Writing Desk. Carter, great stuff as always.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. That'll be tomorrow. Hope you tune in. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.